Night lecture series is being held on Thursday, and we have today two lectures from a very distinguished guest, Professor John Reps, Professor of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University. John Reps is known to undoubtedly all students of urban history. He's one of the most distinguished scholars in that area, and he's known to urban and regional planners for his work in land use controls. John Reps is a native of the state of Missouri. He has a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College and a master's in regional planning from Cornell, and did advanced studies in London. He's been a practicing planner in the state of New York. He has a very lengthy list of publications, including 5 books. Perhaps the best known is the monumental The Making of Urban America. His other books include Tidewater Towns, Monumental Washington, Mining Towns of the Southwest, and soon to be published an important work on the founding of frontier towns in the Old West, to be published shortly by Princeton University Press. He has something like 60 or 70 articles to his credit over the last 10 years. He founded a firm which is Historic Urban Plans Incorporated, which reproduces many of the bird's eye views and old elegant prints plans of American cities and cities abroad. And these prints are available for sale and decorate many homes in this country now. Professor Reps will be giving a lecture tonight, I might mention, at 8 o'clock here on the lithographic views, early lithographic views of American cities. So I urge you to attend that lecture. Today he'll be speaking on the making of urban America, the town planning history of the United States. And it's with great pleasure that I present Professor John Reps of Cornell.
We're going down to the last note here, right? Thank you, Dave. If I had not insisted on a Thursday speaking date, because I have classes on Monday and Tuesday, we all would have been very sorry. I would have been in a cab of a bus or truck for 6 days, eating snow out of a hard hat at best, and it could have been worse than that. Now, buckle up, because we have a formidable job that I'm going to try and do. I'm attempting to review and assess American urban development from the colonial period to the Second World War. Now, that's not made much easier by limiting the subject, as I shall, to the planning tradition of American cities, because virtually all the towns of North America began as planned settlements. That's a fact that conventional American historians have carefully concealed from you, or at least they've overlooked it or regarded it as unimportant. But we're going to be moving at breakneck speed, since 380 years in 1 hour works out, if my arithmetic is correct, as 6 years and 4 months each minute. Now, when Daniel Burnham in 1910 addressed the first international conference on city planning, he saw it as a much easier task. He looked at himself as a member of a new profession and asserted that, and I'm quoting, "the inception of planning in the United States was in the World's Fair in Chicago." He didn't mention that he had helped design it as chairman of the board of design. The beauty of its arrangement and of its buildings made a profound impression. As a first result, the government took up the torch and proceeded to make a comprehensive plan for the future development of the capital. This action was less than 10 years ago, up to which time there had never been a plan commission in the United States. But since then, every considerable town has gone into this study, and there are many hundreds of plan commissions at work at the present. Now, Burnham grossly exaggerated the facts. If my research is correct, it indicates that in 1910, when he spoke, there were exactly 5 official city planning commissions in the country, but his enthusiasm, at least, was prophetic, because within a quarter of a century from the time he spoke, over 700 planning commissions were created, and it was that period between the Chicago Fair of 1893 and the First World War that saw the birth of modern city planning in America. Yet ignored by Burnham, and indeed largely unknown then, and I'm afraid still ill-appreciated, 3.5 centuries of American city planning tradition lay behind in history. From our own perspective, we should realize that the 2 centuries, and 1 year now, since the Revolution, were preceded by an equally long period of settlement. And throughout that era, the 5 colonizing powers, 5 European powers responsible for the colonization of North America, all of them recognized the vital importance of creating urban centers and arranged for their planning either under royal authority or by delegation to chartered companies, trustees, or individual proprietors. Many of these communities, such as Savannah, were skillfully and imaginatively designed. Now here, James Oglethorpe used as his basic module a public square surrounded by 40 house lots and 4 sites for public buildings, a kind of miniature neighborhood unit. 4 of them comprised the town in 1733, and in 1735, 2 more wards or neighborhoods were added on lands Oglethorpe had reserved for urban growth. Other towns, such as Providence in 1638 and Burlington, New Jersey in 1677, were laid out either, as in the case of Providence, in a linear pattern, or in the case of Burlington, a routine grid design of very little merit or sophistication. But whether elaborate or simple, the overwhelming majority of colonial towns shared one common characteristic. They were planned by or for the persons who intended to live and work there. Only in rare instances did colonial towns result from land speculation where absentee owners were motivated primarily by private profit rather than the community interest. In the Spanish colonies, this policy was embodied in the remarkable laws of the Indies of 1573. It's fair, accurate to say this is America's first planning legislation. And under the detailed provisions of those specifications, those laws and ordinances, such places as Santa Fe or San Antonio, which you see here, were carefully planned around a central plaza. After sites were allocated for public and church uses, each settler received a lot in the town and a plot of agricultural land at the outskirts. All other land was reserved for the municipality and the crown, designated as common grazing land, or set aside for eventual urban expansion. Now, there was no similar statute governing the development of agricultural communities in New England, but the land policies there closely resembled those of the Spanish. Now, that suggests that they had a common origin in European history, and that origin surely was a kind of modernized version of the feudal land system. And you can see here at Wethersfield, Connecticut, the long, narrow fields surrounding the nucleated village. Families owned several farm parcels, so located as to share the best land. They were usually allocated by lot, by lottery, that is. Almost all of the towns had some kind of central green or common that provided the equivalent space and functions of the plaza of a Spanish pueblo. While agricultural settlements may have been the most numerous in the colonial period, towns were planned for a variety of other purposes. In a hostile world, military considerations assumed great importance. And certainly that was true of St. Augustine, Florida. Came into existence in 1565 because the Spanish needed a base on the Florida coast to protect their treasure galleons as they sailed up the dangerous Bahama Channel to about the latitude of New York before turning eastward to get favorable winds back to Spain. The great fort, the final fort that was built there, it's about the 6th or 7th fort on the same site, the Castillo San Marco, commanding the entrance to the harbor, you can see on the far right. That dominated the town visually. The garrison community beyond was surrounded by a palisade and a ditch, enclosing this elongated grid of narrow streets leading north and south from the plaza and crossed at right angles by others extending inland from the water. Quite different in design were the two English settlements of 1607. I show you only one. The other one you probably don't know about. I'll mention it in a moment. This is Jamestown in Virginia, taking the form of a triangular fortification enclosing a dozen or so rough huts that would have been scorned in the meanest village of rural England. It had a more ambitiously planned companion, Fort St. George on the coast of Maine, that was attempted as a settlement in 1607. That did not last. Jamestown barely succeeded, barely hung into existence. But the fact that Fort St. George on Maine collapsed, the garrison had to be withdrawn, that was an experience that was to be repeated dozens of times in the colonial era. The first plan for New York City, New Amsterdam, as it then was in 1625, was a very elaborate design conceived by Dutchmen who were comfortably living in Amsterdam with no concept of how impossible it would have been to carry out on the rocky tip of Manhattan Island. It was a Dutch plan, so it had canals, and impossible to dig canals through that rocky granite underpinning at the end of Manhattan. That design was quickly abandoned in favor of a more conventional and really organic street pattern, which you see here. There was a small fort at the tip of Manhattan, north is to the left on this plan. There was a palisade extending from the East River to the Hudson. That guarded against possible attack from the north, and the dusty thoroughfare following its alignment, east and west, inside that wall became known as Wall Street, and it takes its name. The modern street follows that same line. The Swedes and the French were also influenced by the need for protection, by military considerations in the design for their towns. The only Swedish town that we have a record of is a little community called Kristinehamn, designed by Peter Lindström, a Swedish military engineer. He lavished all of his attention on the fort. The town itself is a little grid of 3 or 4 streets crossed by a couple of others. But Louisburg in maritime Canada, by contrast, was a true fortified city with strong bastion walls enclosing the entire settlement. And within it could be found all the features of a French fortress as it might have been planned by Vauban. The Place d'Armes, hospital, barracks, powder magazines, officers' headquarters, houses for civilians, a convent, a monastery, and all the rest. And of course, this city is now under a vigorous program of restoration at the present time. In other French colonial towns, religious orders played a far more important role in shaping the urban structure and the skyline profile. As the small and compact river terrace settlement of Quebec increased in population, the first settlement was actually a building there, and then this little town, something like a Bastide of southwestern France, that outgrew its bounds, and up above on this plateau, beyond this steep escarpment, you see now this parquet-like pattern of development. Now, there obviously was no overall plan for the expansion of Quebec. Individual quarters are, however, just as clearly designed, and they were designed by the religious orders. The Ursulines, the Jesuits, other religious orders began to lay out their lands in new neighborhoods, each following its own axis, creating this parquet-like pattern of radial sectors extending inland from the escarpment rising above the old town. And the profile of Quebec began to look like a provincial town of Europe, with impressive spires from the churches and the convents, providing a spectacular sight as seen from the south bank of the St. Lawrence. The search for religious freedom also led to the creation of many entirely new communities, combining, in this case, the qualities of a fortress with a religious sanctuary. This is Fort Caroline on the Florida coast, predating St. Augustine by 1 year. Here a band of Huguenots, French Huguenots, planned a short-lived haven from persecutions and discrimination in France. They were wiped out by the Spanish in a bloody massacre, and then the Huguenots came back and wiped out the Spanish, and the next year it was a bloody time of it. And it's a rather fanciful depiction of their settlement, although that too has been produced as a replica, and it is well worth seeing on the Florida coast just north of Jacksonville. More numerous as religious settlements and far more successful were the Moravian towns. First at such places as Bethlehem and Lidditz in Pennsylvania. Later in the 1760s in and around Salem, now part of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, in what they called the Wachovia region. Each one of these very carefully ordered and well-built Moravian towns included a central open space around which were located communal living quarters, school, a meeting house, workshops, and stores. This town, too, has been restored in recent years. Don't miss it. It's a well-kept secret. Most people don't know that Old Salem is alive and well, and with dozens of buildings that have been restored. A magnificent thing to explore. And it's more meaningful, I think, when you're there to realize that this is a European pattern that was duplicated in this country, like so many of our other towns, bringing over traditions of town planning and urban development from the colonizing power. Here is the Vatican of the Moravian Church, Herrnhut, now in eastern Germany. And in the case of the Moravians, there were town planning forms and procedures almost as detailed as the Spanish laws of the Indies that were prescribed by church officials in Herrnhut, whose design and appearance was in a way duplicated or at least imitated in the New World. Then we have two other colonies that were founded at least in part for religious regions, Maryland and Pennsylvania. At St. Mary's, the first town in Maryland, this is a conjectural reconstruction. And I think more conjecture has been used here than is advisable. But there is some archaeology going on, and we'll find out more about it later. At St. Mary's, here we have a group of English Catholics. In Pennsylvania, a group of English Quakers established new towns where they could follow their religious preferences freely and without harassment from the established church. Now, both Lord Baltimore and William Penn were well aware of the opportunities for profits that might arise from large-scale land development if their initial settlements prospered and grew. But in both of these colonies, speculative motives remain secondary to social purposes. That's a statement that's easier to maintain for Pennsylvania than it is for Maryland, but I think it is not untrue. Penn's ambitious design for Philadelphia, extending from the Delaware to the Schuylkill River, a distance of 2 miles, and punctuated by 5 open spaces, introduced to the American scene a quite new scale of American planning. And novel also was the designation of the 4 smaller squares for public recreation. Penn referred to these as for the like uses as the moor fields in London. The moor fields in London were lands lying outside the old city walls that had been more or less appropriated by citizens of London for recreation purposes. He clearly looked forward to the time when his city would become a major urban center, but one that would remain, in his marvelous phrase, a green country town. Now, he had all kinds of models to draw from, and some of us have speculated about what he might have been imitating or what might have influenced him. There was an equally bold plan for rebuilding London by a man named Richard Newcourt after the fire of 1666. There are other possibilities that Penn may have based his design on, but it was quite remarkable for its time. The colonial development of Philadelphia as a port and trading center departed somewhat from Penn's intentions. Instead of growing from river to river, it grew along the Delaware frontage. Nearly all of its buildings were built along or near the Delaware because of the importance of water transportation. So here we have a city that becomes a linear city in an axis at right angles from the one that was planned. It's almost like a stage set. If you we're looking at it in 1755, a version published some years later, but the original depiction is 1755. If we went 3 or 4 blocks inland, we'd find open space, and not planned open space. We'd just find unoccupied space. Here's another thing that happened. You can note the division now of Penn's generous blocks into smaller parcels. by narrow streets and lanes and alleys that cut those blocks into smaller places, and a new street paralleling the original street running along the river. And so Philadelphia illustrates, I think, one important and less fortunate aspect of American planning tradition: a concentration of efforts by town planners, colonial town planners, and 19th century planners as well, on the act of town founding and of creating a finite design, an end state. Now, rarely considered was the need to devise a planning process that could be used in shaping growth patterns beyond the initial city limits, or to control effectively land use and building development within. And that certainly was true of Philadelphia. Like Philadelphia, the largest colonial cities were seaports. Here is Newport, Rhode Island. We see it at the time of the Revolution. It dates from 1639. Charleston, South Carolina, hundreds of miles apart, but sharing similar functions, had a common orientation to the waterfront that linked their colonial hinterlands to the mother country. Only in the latter years of the colonial period did these cities begin to use land within their boundaries that were not directly connected with maritime activities. Here is Charleston expanding after 1717, it breaks out of its original perimeter, which is like this, into the area that had been planned as part of its original scheme. And by the end of the colonial period, or the early federal period, important development had taken place in Charleston that was not related to the waterfront. But in the initial years of all of these important colonial cities, it was the waterfront that was extremely important. In these port towns, at such smaller coastal communities as New Bern, North Carolina, or as you see here at the much larger city of New Orleans that the French had created near the mouth of the Mississippi, it was the gridiron plan that predominated. And that certainly is still another characteristic of American colonial planning that would be repeated almost endlessly throughout the 19th century. Boston was the major exception. Not entirely true to say that cows, not men, laid out the streets of Boston, but there's a grain of truth. By the time of the Revolution, as you can see in the upper part of this map, we're looking at Boston in 1769, the northern slopes, subdividers on the northern slopes of Beacon Hill, had turned to the gridiron as they began to cut up the farms and gardens sloping down to the Charles River. And even in the almost medieval parts of Boston's older section, you can see some more regular or form-giving elements, such as the long wharf jutting out from the harbor as an extension of King Street and providing a kind of ceremonial water entrance to the city. But one could not make much of a case that Boston was a planned town. There were individual elements in it that did have some attention to planning, but this is I suppose, the great exception of the colonial period. Successful port development at Charleston and in the northern colonies led English colonial administrators to attempt the same achievement in Virginia and Maryland. Now here, geography and the plantation economy made this extremely difficult. We're looking at the Tidewater region in 1755. Population was widely dispersed throughout the area, because nearly every plantation could have direct deep water connections to the home country right from its plantation wharf or landing. You have this whole series of river estuaries making it possible to bring ships right up to individual plantations. So there was no natural harbor. There was no single place like Charleston that just cried out saying, this is the place for a major city. We have too many places in Virginia and Maryland, so it was very, very difficult for towns to be pumped into existence. Well, we had an attempt, however, in around 1680, and indeed the first British New Towns Law was not 1946, as most American planners or British planners think it, but in 1662, when there was a statute designating 20 sites for official ports, authorizing officials to acquire the land, specified how the town lots were to be sold, and included provisions to eliminate speculative profit. Now, this was followed by similar laws in Maryland, and in Maryland, the laws at one time designated no fewer than, I think it is 68 new towns. It's no wonder that no very large city emerged during the colonial period. The Virginia legislation produced Norfolk as its chief result in terms of a major city, although in the colonial period Norfolk remained quite small. And in Maryland, no major city emerged from that exercise, but a whole series of very delightful smaller communities, chiefly on the eastern shore. But that precedent for using both public land acquisition and taxpayers' funds to establish needed urban settlements made Francis Nicholson's task considerably easier. When as governor of Maryland in 1694 and of Virginia beginning in 1699, he planned two capital cities for both colonies. Now, like Penn before him, and Oglethorpe and Jefferson later, Nicholson was a talented amateur during an age when there were few professionals in the world and none at all in North America. For Annapolis, Nicholson provided the first bit of European Baroque design to be seen in the colonies. We have a residential square up in the upper left-hand corner, Bloomsbury Square. That's plainly modeled after the square of the same name in London. The circular sites for the church and the State House, connected by a series of radial streets, suggest some familiarity with John Evelyn's proposal for London or Christopher Wren's proposals for rebuilding London, both of them prepared immediately after the fire in 1666. Or, equally likely, Nicholson may have drawn on elements of garden design, such as one found in a book which we know to be in his library, written by a Frenchman and translated into English by John Evelyn a year before Nicholson returned from London to Maryland. He had that book with him. I know he spoke to John Evelyn and Christopher Wren, but I can't prove it. It's all surmise, but I know he did it. His city plan is a curious piece of work. This is a little drawing that I've done to show if you prolong the axes of these major streets, they all miss. The whole purpose of this in Baroque planning is so that you get these common sight lines, the axes of major streets, intersecting at a point. And there you put what? You put a church or a monument or an obelisk or a fountain or a statue or whatever. Well, here you have a kind of a pinwheel effect. If this light will work, well, maybe it will, and maybe it won't. It's like the lights that I own. They never work when you need them. I have a long tether here, and maybe I can get out of here without strangling myself. It's this portion of the design that is absolutely the same as this little part of a garden design in that book that Evelyn translated from the French authority on garden planning. So that is the part that gives me a firm conviction that he based it on that book. Now, he's an amateur. He's never planned a town before. He's traveled a little bit on the continent, but he doesn't know much about town planning. So this comes out as a kind of a caricature of Baroque planning, a city that is still one of real character. But in terms of its plan, it's a clumsy bit of design. Very, very awkward. Look at that weak little connection, that narrow net connecting the two great circles. Now, if you and I were going to plan that thing, we'd have some sort of a mall. We'd make a big statement out of that. We'd probably be wrong, I don't know, but we'd do it. Now, when he moves now to Virginia, he had been a lieutenant governor. He had lived in Jamestown. He'd slapped mosquitoes until he was sick of them. He was tired of that miserable place. And so he did what he did in Maryland. He immediately moved the capital from one place to another, and he moved it to a place called Middle Plantation. And at Middle Plantation, up there on the left, marked by A, is the College of William and Mary. And when he had been lieutenant governor of Virginia, he had helped to found the College of William and Mary. It was on the first board of trustees. Now, the College of William and Mary building was being designed in the Office of Royal Works, and presiding over that was Christopher Wren. Now, I don't care whether any records exist or not. I know that when Nicholson went back to London, and that building of a college that he helped to found was being designed in that office, he must have nipped in there and had a little chat with the great architect. He started from that building. About a third of the way down, a fourth of the way down that central street, which is the Duke of Gloucester Street, was Bruton Parish Church. Those were the two things that existed. And he draws that axis, which happens to lie right across on a ridge, a natural drainage area. And that became the principal axis of the town, running from the college, past the church, to his first site for the Capitol, which curiously enough shows is that building off to the right in the middle of the street. Now, his original plan, as I have reconstructed it from contemporary accounts and taking into account all surviving graphic materials that I've been able to discover, his original plan incorporated W's and M's in the form of monograms traced by the streets at the Capitol end, the far end, off to your right, and the streets around Market Square, which is in the center. W's and M's for William and Mary. After Nicholson's term as governor expired in 1705, that rather bizarre treatment of the streets at the Market and the Capitol end was modified, and it's the revised version of this plan without the monograms that governed the subsequent growth of what one could argue was the most elegant little city of the American colonies. And much of the success of that disciplined exercise in axial layout stems from the planning of the major buildings as an integral part of the two-dimensional design. Now, that was a very rare thing in colonial America, a very rare thing in 19th century America, to consider the third dimension of architecture. Our planning, colonial and 19th century, and indeed almost until the present, has been almost exclusively two-dimensional planning. That is to say, streets, lots, blocks, open spaces, but without consideration of the buildings. This is an exception, and I think that helps to explain some of its success. Its appearance was further enhanced by regulations requiring all houses on the Duke of Gloucester Street to meet minimum area and height standards, and to front alike exactly 6 feet from the street line, a prescribed front yard. Not at least 6 feet back, but 6 feet and no more, so that you had a uniform kind of a street line for the city. So all of the elements that would characterize city planning in the New Republic thus had their origins in the colonial period. Let me just summarize those. The widespread use of the grid, combined with some experiments in Baroque design, the creation of a surprisingly large number of capital cities, governmental initiative in the creation of new towns, increased emphasis on town site promotion by private speculators, concentration on two-dimensional planning, some concern for parks and open space, and the founding of towns by utopian or religious societies. Now, that's how I would describe the 19th century, and that's how I would describe the colonial period. There was no sharp break, and indeed, far from halting the growth of towns, the Revolution actually led to the creation of one major settlement, a new town, and the planned expansion of a second. At the Falls of the Ohio in 1779, George Rogers Clark, fresh from his victory in the southern part of this state at Vincennes, established a town on the Kentucky side of the river, which he named for the King of France. And it's from this tiny grid of streets that Louisville steadily expanded on its strategic site at the falls. There had to be a canal someplace around the falls. There were several cities contending for it. Louisville won. Louisville prospered. Clarksville, Shippingsport, Jeffersonville declined. Louisville prospered and became an important city, riverport, trading center, manufacturing community. Now, the second town that was expanded in a planned manner during the Revolution was Richmond. The exposed location of Williamsburg during the Revolution caused the Virginia legislature in 1779 to move the seat of government to the more protected town of Richmond at the falls of the James River, where William Byrd II had established one of the few privately constructed, privately sponsored towns in Virginia 40 years earlier. And it was Thomas Jefferson who prepared the design for the new section of town. Here is the Byrd plan, somewhat expanded. We're looking at a combined map of the town of about 1809, but let me use it for this purpose. There is the Byrd plan. This is the area that was planned by Thomas Jefferson under a mandate under statutes from the Virginia legislature to establish an area for the new capital. He made it twice as large as the law said he should. No one apparently censored him for that. It was not a spectacularly successful design, but what was successful was his design for the Capitol building. Jefferson, just as he got started on this, was made our representative in France, and he prepared architectural drawings working with Kiley, the French architect, who's, I suppose, really should be credited with the major design for the Capitol. Sent that back along with a model, and it was on that pattern that Richmond grew. Now, we're looking at the city in the mid-1830s, and the frontier character of Richmond had long since been replaced by an atmosphere of considerable grace and beauty. We're looking from the west. We can see the Jefferson Capitol up there, the great colonnaded building looking down on the James River. If we were in this same position today, we couldn't see the Capitol because it's been surrounded by a group of banal structures that ought to be dynamited someday. We're seeing a domed city hall, which just to the left of the Capitol, which unfortunately has come down, and we're looking over there at the left at the penitentiary that Charles Latrobe designed. But here's a city of some considerable grace, even making allowances for the romantic additions of the artist. Now, there were other states that followed Virginia's lead, but decided to create entirely new communities as political and administrative centers. South Carolina, in 1786, devised a procedure that was subsequently imitated by many others. The legislature authorized a commission to select and acquire a site, direct its planning, reserve locations for public use, and sell lots and blocks to obtain funds for erecting governmental buildings and making other civic improvements. And so, for Columbia, South Carolina, the planned capital done by public initiative, this is the design. Now, a former owner of the land used for this city is said to have remarked rather sourly that they spoiled a damn fine plantation to make a damn poor town. I think he was ultimately to be proved wrong, as the city and the Capitol complex and the university gradually began to fill the enormous grid surveyed under the direction of the commissioners. I wouldn't argue that this is a great plan. I would argue it's a superb site, and Columbia today is one of the very, very attractive cities of the South and the country as a whole. Georgia in 1786 at Louisville, and later in 1805 at Milledgeville, which you see here, established new capitals in the same manner, with the plan of Milledgeville and its 4 big public squares arranged in an axial pattern being of particular interest. Raleigh, North Carolina, had its origins in 1791 when the North Carolina legislature created its Capital City Commission, allowed it to select the site. The commission then planned the town, sold lots. The proceeds from the lot sales were used for erecting the first public buildings, and on a plan not unlike that of Philadelphia, with a central square and 4 subsidiary squares. So, there were ample precedents for the establishment of a new national capital when President Washington in 1791 selected a location on the Potomac River, appointed the French artist Pierre L'Enfant to prepare its design. Washington was able to convince the landowners, the boundaries of whom you see here, to place the entire site in his hands, with all lands for streets to be conveyed to the federal government without charge, sites for public buildings to be paid for at the rate of 25 pounds an acre, and half of the lots to become federal property. One of the greatest real estate deals of all time, I suppose. Now, L'Enfant first selected a number of commanding sites for the principal buildings, then planned a street system to provide direct connections between them. That's the basis for his great radial boulevard or avenue system. Then he added an underlying grid to create smaller blocks and to provide access to the interior of those big spaces. He used many of those resulting multi-street intersections for squares and circles and a variety of other civic spaces to establish that intricate matrix of axial relationships. For the monumental focus of this enormous composition, L'Enfant thrust westward from Capitol Hill a great mall to intersect the south axis of the White House. These were the two legs of a triangle whose hypotenuse, Pennsylvania Avenue, formed part of a network of major radial thoroughfares. Now, L'Enfant explained all of this to President Washington in a series of letters and memos in practical terms, but it's clear that he was at least equally influenced by the purely abstract design of Versailles, where he had spent about 8 years of his boyhood, where his father was a court painter. Well, it's paradoxical that the plan of our capital city, sorry, that's a little dim, the plan for our capital city should be so distinctly un-American. It's a design motif, a design form conceived in Europe to glorify, magnify the position and glories of despotic kings and emperors. And here it is used as the plan for a capital of what was loudly proclaiming itself as the only true democracy. There were domestic and foreign critics that attacked its hopelessly ambitious scale. We're now at about the Civil War, looking down at the capital off to our left, and up until that time, Washington really was nothing much more than an overgrown, dusty village, very much like, Napoleon referred to The Hague as the largest village in Europe, and I suppose that would have been appropriate for Washington. And there were many scornful epithets that were coined: the city of magnificent distances, the city of magnificent intentions. Pennsylvania Avenue, at least at the base of Capitol Hill, was referred to as the Great Serbonian Bog, and there were stories about carriages dropping out of sight in the mud down below, a little outdone. But parts of the mall were used for cattle grazing, and in the outlying parts of the town, some of the squares and even the streets themselves were used for growing crops. But for most Americans, Washington's generous scale and elaborate plan symbolized the great future of a new and vibrant nature. And it was not strange that some of its features would be imitated on the cities founded on the western frontier. So here's Buffalo, plan dating from 1804. Now, who plans it? Joseph Ellicott. Joseph Ellicott had for a time served as a surveyor at Washington. His brother Andrew Ellicott really succeeded L'Enfant and prepared the first detailed plan, engraved map of the city. And so he's clearly drawing on that vocabulary which he had learned while he was in Washington. It's an attempt at a Baroque town. At Detroit in 1805, Judge Woodward, once a resident of Washington, a friend of L'Enfant, perhaps his attorney, produced a much more eccentric scheme of radial streets combined with a repeating circular and rectangular system of civic squares. But Woodward probably introduced to this radial notion, this Baroque kind of plan, from his association with L'Enfant or his experience at Washington. 3 decades later, James Doty, who had lived in Detroit, planned Madison, Wisconsin in a matter of days, and then successfully promoted his paper town before the Wisconsin legislature, meeting then to select a site for the new state's capital. And you can see here Doty used L'Enfant's combination of radial and grid streets to assure maximum visibility for the Capitol Square, and to connect that focal point, Capitol Square, leading up to the upper left-hand corner, to the university site. So you had a kind of an axial relationship of the two most important buildings of that town. Now, there were other states in the 19th century that followed the procedure pioneered by South Carolina, that is, the public commission for a capital city, relying then on public commissions rather than private speculative towns like Doty's Madison. And of course, one of the examples is Indianapolis and Alexander Ralston. Now, Ralston, too, had been a surveyor at Washington. And it's clear, I think, that he was trying, and not very well, not very skillfully, to apply to Indianapolis, this new capital, some of the things that he had learned in Washington. At Tallahassee in 1824, state commissioners incorporated the main elements of the plan of Raleigh and Philadelphia. Look at the central square of the complex of 9, and then within that you can see the letter E is the big square for the capital, and then there are 4 others symmetrically disposed around. They're very much like the Philadelphia plan. For Jackson, Mississippi, the capital commissioners of that state used an idea originated by Thomas Jefferson. He had recommended that both for health reasons, primarily for health reasons, that the new towns being built in the West should be laid out with every other block permanently reserved as an open square or park. Now, the planners of Jackson added to this their own contribution, up in the upper part of the slide, sites for the Capitol in the center, the courthouse and the college flanking the Capitol, and connected by that gently curving street that followed the line, the crest of a hill. Major buildings were carefully placed to terminate the views down the 3 wide streets leading through the Jeffersonian checkerboard to that crescent-shaped thoroughfare. And there were other state and territorial capitals developed by public commissions, so there's public new towns, in the same manner. Columbus, Ohio, Jefferson City, Missouri, Iowa City, the territorial and first state capital, Prescott, Arizona, Lincoln, Nebraska. Here is Lincoln's plans, rather dim slide, but and you may have